This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. I'm Eric Morse, welcoming you to our podcast series of Fall 2013 events. Our first military history night of the season, held on September 11th, features Patrick Murphy, who tells us about the wartime history of the Royal Navy's base at Scapa Flow in the Orkney Islands, and the fascinating legacy left there by Italian prisoners of war in World War II.
Thank you, Pat, as always, for your kind words of introduction. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Tonight's history presentation, Capella Italiana, the Italian chapel, Scapa Flow. Where the North Sea joins the Atlantic Ocean, just off the tip of northern Scotland, the Orkney Islands jut from the sea. With a history stretching back over 6 millennia, the islands have seen continuous occupation and the comings and goings of seafaring peoples from far and near. From as far back as the Stone Age, the islands have been a haven and home to many Vikings, Celts and Picts, to mention but a few. From across the sea they came, saw and settled, and each in turn left their mark on the customs, the culture and the habitat of the Orkney Islands. More recently, the islands played host to ships of the Royal Navy, and for 2 World Wars, Scapa Flow became the principal anchorage of the British fleet. The 80 square miles of sea basin enclosed by Burray, South Ronse, Flotte Ahoy and mainland islands were, for many reasons, considered an ideal anchorage. And it was from Scapa Flow that ships of Britain's Grand Fleet sailed to do battle with the German High Seas Fleet on May the 31st, 1916. The battle that followed ended with both sides claiming a victory for what was considered to be a tactical draw. Jutland, or Skagerrak as the Germans called it, was the last great battle fought solely by surface ships. As the German High Seas Fleet never again challenged the British dominance of the North Sea, the outcome of the battle was in effect a strategic victory for the British. Needless to say, the British were considerably disappointed that the enemy had not been decisively defeated, and as Britain's losses were heavier than her opponent, the battle was claimed to be a German victory. For both victor and vanquished, the cost was high. The British suffered 6,784 casualties and lost 3 battle cruisers, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers. German losses consist of 1 old battleship, 1 battlecruiser, 4 light cruisers and 5 destroyers, as well as 3,099 casualties. The importance of Scapa Flow lay in its location. Like Norway, the Orkney Islands are situated at the choke point of the North Sea, where it meets the ocean waters of the Atlantic. The Royal Navy made use of its base in the Orkney Islands to confine the ships of the German High Seas Fleet and maintain its control over access to the Atlantic. When the Great War ended on the 11th hour of the 11th day of November 1918, the armistice terms had yet to be agreed and committed to paper as the Treaty of Versailles. Whilst negotiations were in progress, the bulk of the Imperial German Navy's High Seas Fleet sailed into internment and as floating hostages remained at anchor in the waters of Scapa Flow. Undefeated in battle, they awaited the outcome of the Versailles discussions and settlement of their future. They had not surrendered and remained German property manned by German skeleton crews. Their guns spiked and engines run down, the hostage ships and their restive crews languished as negotiations dragged on. Midsummer's Day, June 21st, 1919, The Royal Navy tender, the Flying Kestrel, set off on a day trip with 400 eager and excited school children aboard. Neither the children nor the crew were prepared for what was to happen on that faithful summer's day. Steaming through rows of ships, the Navy tender made its way slowly south and past battleships and destroyers, their rails lined with the disenchanted and sullen remnants of their former crew. Compliment. As they went, the children waved to the watching seamen, who, if so inclined, responded in like fashion. Those remaining let the children pass by without a smile or acknowledgement. Living with uncertainty was a wearing experience, and for the interned crews there was little or nothing to smile about. However, what seemed like an eternity was about to end at last. News from the Versailles Conference wasn't good, and when it became clear that the treaty stipulated all interned ships had to surrender, the writing was on the wall for the German High Seas Fleet. As the Allies insisted on Germany's compliance with the terms of the treaty and were unwilling to compromise, Admiral von Reuter had to weigh the options and decide. Unable to put to sea or use his ship's ordnance against the enemy, he could either surrender his ships to the British or scuttle the German High Seas Fleet. A signed treaty would bring to an end the armistice and allow the Royal Navy to legally board and seize ships under his command. Admiral von Reuter opted to prevent his ships falling into enemy hands and prepare them for scuttling in advance of seizure. At noon, the Flying Kestrel reached Line's End and went about for the return leg of its journey. The leisurely cruise had been an interesting experience, and for once a chance for the children to see up close Kaiser Bill's Navy. As the Navy tender steam, North Agent stopped, and without warning went to full speed ahead. Below decks, sweating stokers in frenzied haste shoveled coal into the boilers, and with eyes fixed on the steam pressure gauge, they laboured on. The churning screws sliced through the waters as the ship's engine responded to the call for speed. With heaving decks, the doughty tender ploughed its way through the swell, and as it went, the children sensed something was about to happen. Following the signal from Admiral von Reuter, the immolation of all 74 vessels went ahead as planned, and with due dispatch the German High Seas Fleet was consigned to the deep. Once the scuttling of their vessels was set in motion, their crews took to the lifeboats and abandoned ship. As they pulled for shore and the scuttled ships began to settle, the seawater poured through open hatches, portholes and damaged sea cocks. For some, it was a time for tears, and for others, an end to their confinement aboard ship, and after months spent afloat, a welcome return to terra firma. And for those fearing a resumption of hostility should the treaty negotiations fail, suffice to say, preventing the seizure of the High Seas Fleet for use against Germany was sufficient vindication for the action they took. At a stroke, they had put beyond reach the fruit of victory and the spoil of war. The German High Seas Fleet scuttling came as a total surprise to the youngsters on board the Flying Kestrel. All Acadian children were used to seeing warships on the water, but never, ever heading for Davy Jones's locker. As one by one the sinking ships took leave of the surface and went to join their anchors at the bottom of Scapa Flow, the shrill whistle of escaping air and the sound of tortured metal signalled their final gasp before they disappeared below the waves. For the children, the sight and sounds of that eventful day was to remain with them for the rest of their lives. Right there before their eyes, history in the making. Apart from the Flying Kestrel, only a handful of tenders, patrol boats and a couple of destroyers were left to act as fleet watchers and guard force. The main force, 5 battleships, departed that morning on a routine torpedo exercise. With so few ships available, there's little could be done to prevent the scuttling of the German High Seas Fleet. After the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet, the world lived through 2 decades of sabre-rattling and uneasy peace. Words and empty promises failed to secure lasting peace, and for those who had endured the war that will end war, hope gave way to resignation. Compromise and concessions were met with the escalating demands from a Führer bent on conquest and territorial gain. His insatiable appetite knew no limits until, in the world of his invention, the loss of liberty became the price of peace. Only then did Britain and France rise to the challenge, opting to oppose rather than participate in Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. Late, if not too late, they girded their loins and made ready. Confident they could halt German expansion, the Allies declared war on Germany on September the 1st, 1939. Hitler was taken aback. The Führer was obviously convinced the Allies would cave in, and when put to the test, Britain and France would not go to war over Poland. Diplomatic horse trading and appeasement initiatives responsible for the shaping of German policy in 1939 was based on the belief that the British regarded their own commitment to Poland as a dangerous irrelevance. And both Hitler and Ribbentrop seem to have suspected from this and similar evidence that the British would not seriously intervene if the German army marched into Poland. But they were wrong. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Edouard de la Dare would both have preferred peace, but neither could abandon their commitment to Poland and to each other. At the start of World War II, Winston Churchill returned to the Admiralty as First Sea Lord, and if it was as such, he boarded a train bound for Scotland carrying a lockbox of secret documents. As the train steamed its way north, Churchill's thoughts were fixed on his remote destination, Scapa Flow, going back to a time in the First World War when he recalled, on 2 or 3 occasions in the fall of 1914, the most memorable on October 17, when the alarm was given, there was a U-boat inside the anchorage. Guns were fired, destroyers thrashed the waters, and the whole gigantic armada put out to sea in haste and dudgeon. With this in mind, Churchill turned his attention to the lockbox of classified documents and the Chief of Staff's committee report dealing with Scapa Flow defences. Since their installation during the First World War, time, tide and tempest had worked well their mischief. At the start of World War II, they were found to be in sad repair and would remain so until the spring of 1940. Aboard the Admiral's flagship HMS Nelson, Commander-in-Chief Sir Charles Forbes confirmed sea access channels were not properly netted and the old steel webs were rotten and missing where needed. Churchill issued an urgent order to make good deficiencies and upgrade defences. The parallel state of the defences did not escape the attention of the Wehrmacht. Within days of the outbreak of World War II, Lieutenant Wellner, the captain of U-16 operating east of the Orkneys, found himself at the mercy of a strong westerly current. Unable to resist the tidal flow, the submarine was swept through the turbulent narrows of the Orkney Island until released from its grip and let go. Free of the current, U-16 headed for home. Back at the base, the captain submitted his report, which detailed his involuntary passage through the anchorage of Scapa Flow. Karl Donitz, Commodore of the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine, a veteran submarine captain, was quick to realise the significance of Lieutenant Veller's report. Getting into Scapa Flow was difficult, but not impossible. The Kirk Sound Channel was just over 15 metres wide and about 3.5 fathoms at its deepest point. True, it was blocked by mines and anti-submarine booms and sunken ships, but it was navigable between high and low tide when the water was slack. Air photographs taken by the Luftwaffe just days after the commencement of hostilities gave details of the base's defences and their whereabouts. Clearly, Scapa Flow was not impregnable. Daylight penetration of the anchorage defences would be difficult and dangerous, but in the dark of night, a U-boat might succeed against the odds and survive. Admiral Donitz was well aware that two officers of Germany's Imperial Navy, Corvette Captain von Henning and Captain Lieutenant Emsman, attempted to penetrate the base at Scapa during World War I. Both failed to return from their mission. Donitz, as a former officer of the Kaiserreich, Germany's equivalent to the Royal Navy, would also have good cause to remember the scuttling of Germany's Grand Fleet. With the stakes so high, was it worth the risk? Certainly, all things being considered, it was thought feasible for a surface U-boat to manoeuvre between the block ships and booms following a high tide when the water was slack and deep enough to navigate. Regardless of risk, a chance to attack Britain's home fleet, anchored in Scapa Flow, was an opportunity too good to be missed. Admiral Donitz sent for Captain Gunther Prien. The attack was timed for a moonless night, with one of the highest tides of the year, October 13, 1939. 5 days after leaving Kiel, U-47 reached Scapa Flow. As dawn approached, the U-boat submerged and rested on the bottom of Home Sound, there to await the darkness of the Orcadian night. At the appropriate time, Captain Prien revealed to the crew the purpose and importance of U-47's mission. The crew received the news with evident delight. Since their departure from Kiel, with only enough provisions for a voyage of short duration, they had convinced themselves they were on a mission of some importance. The assumption gained credence as opportunities to sink enemy shipping were ignored and let pass. Such reticence on the captain's part was out of character and could only be explained by the need to avoid advertising the whereabouts of U-47 or a desire to save torpedoes for worthwhile targets. Crew speculation ended when Captain Prien told the crew their target was the hated anchorage of Scapa Flow. Attacking Scapa was an enterprise fraught with danger. Crew members harboured no illusions as to their fate if their attack failed or came to a sudden and abrupt end. Whether or not they were embarking on a death or glory mission remained to be seen. However, it was crystal clear that on the bottom of Home Sound, jumping ship was not an option. Time spent on the seabed was time spent waiting and counting the hours before the pending attack. When the waiting gave way to the summons to action, the crew manned their posts and made ready to surface. Breaking surface, the U-boat levelled to a hull-down position so as to keep a low profile and avoid detection. From the open deck hatch emerged the captain and bridge watch lookouts in quick succession. Moving swiftly, watch officer and ratings took up their positions to scan the sea, the sky, and the scene before them. What they expected and what they saw was different. Instead of the darkness of a moonless night lending its cloak to hide their presence, the U-boat sat on the surface, under a sky lit with the shimmering glow of the Aurora Borealis or Northern Lights. For the captain and crew of U-47, the exposure was disconcerting and added to the risk and dangers of their audacious venture. Gunter Prien was not for turning back. Undaunted, he decided to press ahead, and even if the heavens of ghostly green made surface attack perilous, he would, if needs be, submerge to launch his torpedoes. The whims of the gods would not deter. Succeed or fail, time would tell. There was to be no turning back. Whereas Gunter Prien was done with the capricious gods, they had yet to finish with him. Before long, he was scraping hulls with block ships and extracting U-47 from the cloying sands of Kirk Sound. Tasked by torment and slow progress, captain and crew pressed on. Nerve, skill, and good fortune saw them through until U-47 was clear of obstacles and into the anchorage. So far, so good. Their presence went undetected. Alas, having got to the cupboard, it was all but bare. Aerial photographs taken by the Luftwaffe just days before showed the entire home fleet in the basin, but now only 2 ships were present in the anchorage. Where was the rest of the home fleet? The reason for the home fleet's absence from Scapa was that following the Luftwaffe photo reconnaissance flight, the Admiralty received a reporting sighting of the Gneisenau, a battle cruiser and its escorts off the coast of Norway. Without delay, the British dispatched battle cruisers Hood and Repulse, the battleships Nelson and Rodney, together with carrier Furious, with escort destroyers to intercept and engage the enemy. The Royal Oak was left to close the gap between the Orkney and Shetland Islands, which she did until the following day when bad weather, massive waves and storm damage forced the battleship back to port. Back at Scapa Flow, the crew of the Royal Oak sat about repairing damage and taking on stores. Officers and men felt safe and secure in their anchorage. And when order was restored and victuals loaded, crew members not on watch took to their hammocks, there to rest, relax and sleep after a demanding day. Meanwhile, the home fleet, returning from Norway, was ordered to proceed to Loch Ewe on the west coast of Scotland, where exposure to Luftwaffe attack was considerably less. With the bulk of the home fleet absent from Scapa Flow, only the battleship Royal Oak and seaplane carrier Pegasus were at anchor when U-47 attacked. Gunter Prien fired a spread of 4 torpedoes. Only 3 left their tubes as intended. The captain held his breath as he waited for the detonations to follow. Apart from a muffled explosion, there was nothing to suggest the torpedoes had found their mark. For captain and crew, it was a disappointing result. With cool resolve, Captain Prien went about, lined up on a target ship, and fired a torpedo from the stern tube. As the torpedo left the submarine and sped on its way, he checked his watch until the missile runtime ran out. Once again, the torpedo attack failed to end as expected. For Gunter Prien, all was not well. Had he braved the hazards of entry into Scapa Flow only to be a victim of malfunction? The question begged an answer, but until U-47 torpedoes were spent, the answer was not forthcoming. Contrary to expectations, the muted explosion did not give rise to the pandemonium of heated pursuit The torpedo that glanced off the anchor chain of the Royal Oak caused only minimal damage to an area just ahead of the collision bulkhead and the ship's inflammable material store. Even though the battleship was shaken and taken on water when damaged, her trim remained the same. After investigation, it was thought that spontaneous combustion in the paint locker was responsible for the damage, and as the explosion was minor, there was no need to sound the general alarm. The explosion had not alerted the midwatch as to the presence of U-47. And as it was thought incredible that a torpedo could have struck their ship in the safety of Scapa Flow, those responsible never suspected they were under attack. Captain Prian ordered a withdrawal, and after reloading his forward tubes, returned to the attack. Firing his last 3 torpedoes, he awaited on the outcome. This time, 3 torpedoes struck with devastating effect. In minutes consumed by fire and wrecked by explosion, the Royal Oak rolled over and sank at its moorings. And so the battleship and 833 members of her crew joined the rusting hulls of the German High Seas Fleet at the bottom of Scapa Flow. With debris raining down from a sky lit by flame, Captain Prian made for the open sea. Knowing time and tide waits for no man, he had to make it through Kirk Sound before ebb tide robbed U-47 of the means of escape and left her beached like a whale, or trapped in the shallows. With the sands of time running out and the channel waters draining away, time was of the essence. U-47 passed through Kirk Sound without mishap, reached the open sea and set a course for home. The captain and crew returned to a hero's welcome. Honours and medals were conferred on every member of the ship's company, and after a flight to Berlin, they sat at table and dined with the Führer. The Royal Oak's sinking was announced on the BBC, and when addressing Parliament, a grim-faced Winston Churchill admitted that Prian's exploit was remarkable. When the anchorage defences were breached, measures in hand were not in place. The naval base of Scapa Flow was neither safe nor secure and would remain so until unused channels were sealed by permanent causeways linking the islands of Scapa Flow. Existing boom and blockship barriers had no future. Makeshift measures of the past would give way to walls of concrete high enough to frustrate seaborne attack and able to withstand the elements for years to come. Work on the Churchill barriers commenced in 1940. With the delivery of materials came the need for labour. Obtaining a workforce in wartime was difficult because most men were either in the services or engaged on essential work. However, the causeways were given top priority and construction went ahead using the labour of captive warriors taken from the field of battle and transported from one extreme of their ancient and one-time empire to a place north of the Antonine Wall and far beyond the writ of Rome. The POW's arrival was without trumpet flourish or carpet red. They came not as the legions of imperial power or precursors of system change, but as soldiers of Italy captured in North Africa and brought to a place of confinement on the remote and distant Orkney Islands. Once landed, the desert veterans were pressed into service and put to work on the Churchill barriers. There being no such thing as absolute security, it is true to say, security once compromised is anything but secure. The Royal Navy, having paid a high price for laxity, was quick to act. With due haste, the Admiralty increased the scale of Scapa Flow defences and made every effort to secure the anchorage against enemy attempts to enter. The building of causeways to bridge the gaps between the islands, resolve the security problems, and at the same time disposed of the need for ferry services. Road access over the barriers to adjoining islands released communities from their dependence on waterborne transport and the vagaries of climate. And so the latter-day Romans, like their forefathers, up until their departure from Britain in the early part of the 4th century AD, found themselves employed as builders of roads and defensive works. Although strangers in a foreign land, the POWs were not without roots, culture or belief. And as is the case with many, soldiers separated from loved ones and things held dear do oft turn to the deities of faith when needs must and spirit moves. The temporal requirements of prisoners engaged on the construction of the barriers were met by the military who, when asked, agreed to provide accommodation for religious worship. The accommodation consisted of 2 nissen huts joined end to end to form what was to become Capella Italiana. And as its name suggests, it was less than spacious. However, what it lacked in stature and capacity, it more than made up for by its service to the POW community based on Lamb Home. And when the decorative talents of the prisoners gave expression to the fervour of their faith, the mundane huts underwent a transformation. By the grace of God, the milk of human kindness, and the munificence of the powers that be, huts, driftwood and surplus to requirement concrete went into the chapel building and its embellishment. Since time immemorial, humankind have decorated their halls and habitat with drawings of the chase, conquest and tribal icons. And amongst the chroniclers and artists of past repute, Italian masters have exerted a huge influence on the development and popularity of classical art in all its forms. Coming from the same tradition as the fresco painters of renown, it was hardly surprising that the prisoners attending service in the bare, functional enclosure of end-to-end nissen huts should look to the painters of yesteryear for inspiration and momentary release from the constraints of captivity. Perhaps they could be forgiven for thinking if they couldn't go to the Sistine Chapel, then they should bring the Sistine Chapel to the Orkney Islands. To be fair, one has to say, was such a laudable ambition ever their goal, its realisation was to be curtailed by circumstance and the ending of World War II. That is, for all the prisoners except one. Domenico Chiocchetti, artist, designer, and driving force behind the construction and decoration of the Italian chapel, continued on before, after his band of craftsmen and helpers uprooted and left for home. With the war nearing its end and Italy's departure from the Axis fold, there was no reason to hold captive the servicemen of a non-belligerent state. For the POWs of Camp 60, that meant release and repatriation in May of 1945. And now they were all gone, Domenico was on his own, left behind to put the finishing touches to the font before making his return to Italy and home. For Domenico, completing the chapel became a mission, sparked and fueled by the enthusiasm of a visiting Italian padre, Father Gioacchino Giacovazzi. Domenico and his helpers gave of their best to turn a vision into a reality. The success of their endeavours was to result in the creation of a Mediterranean monument, Capella Italiana. And in so doing, they left their mark on the customs, the culture and the habitat of the Orkney Islands. When finished, chapel, font, Domenico made ready to depart. Taking a last look at the chapel before leaving, he had good cause to be satisfied. In place of the functional and cheerless enclosure provided, there now stood a place of worship endowed with all the grace and beauty that scarcity would allow. Not lacking in splendour or adornment, it bore witness to the devotion and commitment of Camp 60 POWs. They could with some justification claim their war was not wholly devoted to destruction. Content that the chapel would be cherished and cared for by the Orcadians, Domenico bid farewell to the home and the work of his captive years. Years passed but not wasted, time spent but not squandered. Deo Ivante. Happy after his return to Italy and a life once led, Domenico Chiocchetti was perhaps taken by surprise when contacted by a group of Orcadians interested in restoring the Italian chapel to its former glory. There being nothing new under the sun, it's hardly unknown for an artist to fall in love with his work. Domenico loved his work, and having put his heart and soul into the painting of the Madonna and Child and those of the angels and saints gracing the walls and scenes of the chapel, he welcomed a chance to see his work again. And so it came to pass. The former POW returned to the Orkneys, and this time it was by invitation. Domenico, as a guest of the Italian Chapel Preservation Committee, ended up on what was once referred to as Camp 60. Since his departure, the camp had changed and was not as he had left it 15 years ago. Gone were the accommodation huts that housed and sheltered the captive community. Only the floors of concrete remained to evidence their whereabouts. Still to be seen, perched on its plinth, it was the statue of St. George slaying the dragon, and dressed in weathered concrete, Capella Italiana. Entering the chapel after a decade and a half, Domenico took stock of his surroundings. The interior changed, and not for the better. Rescuing the chapel from the decline of years was his intent, and thanks to the good people of the Orkney Islands, he was there to supervise its restoration and repair. The work of restoration, when finished, was a credit to the artist and the craftsman who made it all possible. First and foremost, Domenico Chiocchetti, painter of the walls and the sanctuary ceiling, who used a prayer card given to him by his mother as a guide when painting his version of the Madonna of the Olives. Next in line came Palumbo, who used his metal working skills to good advantage when making a metal screen designed by Domenico. No less important to the success of the project was Brutta Pasta, a prisoner renowned for his cement creations, followed by electricians Primavera and Micheloni, others who gifted of their time, talent and skills. To serve they created a chapel of beauty, and it's thanks to them the islands have a memento to treasure and share with the tens of thousands of visitors who journey to see and marvel at the skill and resourcefulness of Camp 60 captives. Like a footprint on the moon, Capella Italiana is one of a kind, a symbol of human endeavour, a step in the right direction, a milestone on the road to peace, small, beautiful, inspirational. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Question and answer. If anybody has any questions, please, now is the time to ask them. Okay, Patrick.
Right. Go for it.
Patrick, under what jurisdiction was it permitted to use Italian prisoners of war to work on military installations for the British Navy?
Well, they were not supposed to be used, Tony, they were not supposed to be used on any installation that would aid and abet the Allies in their pursuit of victory. But what they did was, Churchill was quite shrewd about this, this was an environmental thing. Building the bridges or the barriers provided access to the islands. So for that reason, he was not in contravention with the Geneva Convention. It was okay for him to do that. But incidentally, and it worked out, that also was a very substantial fortification of the Scapa Flow. All right? Thank you, Tony.
Patrick, how many actual people do you think work on the, how many people actually were working on the chapel itself?
Just over 500, Pat.
How many?
Just over 500.
Oh.
Yeah, there was more. There was about 1,500 in the other islands,
Yeah.
but Lamholm, about 500.
Yeah, I wonder.
There were Italian prisoners down in Fort Henry in Kingston, and I've been given to understand that they painted a ceiling there, and then it was found that it was illegal to billet prisoners in an historic site, so they were moved out, and the Canadian government painted over all those murals, and I wonder if it would be possible to get the paint off and find the murals.
Well, I do happen to know in Ireland, some enlightened Irishmen decided to paint a medieval ceiling with whitewash, and it's had experts over from Cambridge, England, to take this whitewash off this ceiling, and it's going to take many years. They did so much every year, but they would then reckon that they could only less than 30% that they could recover. So it's always difficult, depending on the materials used, obviously, and the porous surface of whatever they're painted on. But Italians, you can't keep them from painting. No disrespect intended.
I wanted to ask, is the building still there? Can you visit it? Is there a way of getting there?
I would think so, because there's tens of thousands go there every year, and it's just phenomenal. It's almost, it is just that. There are so many people go to see it, and it is a thing of beauty. I've yet to go and see it. I've looked over from the tip of John Gross towards over Pendleton Firth towards the Orkney Islands, but I've yet to go. But it's on my wish list, and I shall get there sometime. But it doesn't stop me reading up about it.
I was there as a tourist just about a year ago, and you probably know about this. There's a little a bit of minutiae. One of the workers at the very end of the aisle before you go out the door, in the middle, put a little heart, a little red heart, elevated like a haut relief, bas-relief, in stone, and it was painted red. And they show this to the tourists, and this was one of the workers who was, celebrating his fiancée back in
Oh, nice.
Italy. Yeah.
That's a romance. Yeah, it's interesting. In Tasmania, they have in the Port Arthur, they also have examples like tattoos, and the tattoos that hearts and anchors. If you had a heart, you wanted to go back to where you came from, but if you had an anchor, a heart and anchor, you didn't. It was, you would give up all hope. But thank you for that, by the way.
So, any more questions? That's it? Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for a most interesting and extremely well-researched topic. And as such, I'd like to give you a little gift from RCMI in appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening to us today. Watch for announcements of future event transcripts, and we hope that you will be able to join us in person for our regular speakers events.